This is the Great War Discussion Group. Doug Darling will be talking today about the Kaiserlichemarine, the Imperial German Navy, which had, as navies go around the world, one of the shortest lifetimes, lasting from 1871 to 1919. Doug is going to tell us some of the reasons why and some of the things that it did during its short but highly eventful lifetime. Doug, you're on.
All right, thank you. As you can see the title slide, it didn't end well. All right, here's what we're going to try to address today. Come back to the outline just because my kids who I inflicted this briefing on said that they lost track of where we were on it. So I just go through it that way. Why did I pick this topic? On the left, you'll see my high school senior research project was on first generation battleships, dreadnoughts. And the third war game I ever owned on the right-hand side was the Battle of Jutland. So I've had an interest in this for a while. Go from there. Prussian Navy, the predecessor of the Imperial German Navy, really wasn't much. Prussian electors and then the king was very much land power, worried about the lack of defensible borders, and really didn't have much use for Navy. Frederick the Great thought that he would rather have another battalion than ships. So that's basically what they did. Nevertheless, they did build up a small Navy. They lost it in the 7 Years' War because of their merchant activities. After the Napoleonic Wars were over, they actually started to develop somewhat of a Navy again as a protective fleet for their ships. Didn't really do much outside the Baltic area. And then, of course, the Prussia morphed in 1850 to the North German Confederation. That's about the time that the Hanoverian dynasty in England lost control of Hanover due to Salic law. When Queen Victoria took over, women could not inherit. So instead, the Prussians took advantage of that loss of British influence in Germany. All right. Succeeded in 1871 when the German Empire actually started. Didn't really do much during the Franco-Prussian War. The vastly superior French Navy blockaded it pretty much in its ports. There was a minor action between a gunboat in Havana, Cuba, and a French dispatch boat. Neither ship was sunk, captured, or anything else. They did exchange hostilities, though. And, of course, the French couldn't take advantage of their supremacy at sea during the Franco-Prussian War because of getting their hind ends handed to them by the German army. Okay. Once the Imperial Constitution went into effect, the Constitution required a Navy. Interesting thing was the Navy was commanded by Army officers till 1888. They slowly started developing the basis for a modern Navy with, things like Naval Academy, Engineer Corps, Medical Corps, other things like that. Had a lot of ward-off type of ships, remembering that technological advancements going on throughout the world as far as Navy matters were changing so much that everything was an experiment because nobody really knew what was going to work. This guy here, what can I say about Kaiser Wilhelm II, who really caused a lot of problems for everybody? If he had been raised by his dad and his mom instead of his granddad and Bismarck, things would have probably been better. What his grandmother, Queen Victoria of England, and his mother had to say about him in his writings were basically he was not their writings on him were not complimentary in many impacts. Right after his dad, Frederick, died, he wanted to do something with the Navy because he was very envious of his uncle, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and wanted to be able to kind of show up his uncle. He spoke excellent English. He was actually stood death watch on his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and helped his uncle put her in her coffin after she died. Amazing when you commission a study, the study usually comes back with the conclusions you want in it, in many bureaucracies at least. And the Admiral gets split into three different parts. The Imperial Navy Office, which plays a large part in the German Imperial Navy saga, was formed then. They all reported directly to the Kaiser. That would be great if Wilhelm II was actually an individual who was willing to devote time, energy, and effort into doing the coordination necessary to have a Navy. But he just wanted to be the supreme warlord, wave his little baton around, and lead cavalry charges at the end of the annual maneuvers. Didn't want to plan them, didn't want to umpire them, didn't want to do anything else with them. And the Navy, three major organizations reporting directly to Kaiser initially. By the outbreak of war, that was 8 naval organizations, not a whole lot of coordination between the different organizations. They were very much stovepipe. Come 1890. Alfred Thayer Mahan's Influence of Sea Power on History. That's my copy that I've had since about 1972. Control the seas, 6 basic characteristics. He kind of forgot about the geographic position being important. Germany didn't have much of a seacoast on the North Sea, and what it did have, you had the breakwater of the British Isles immediately adjacent to it that could control access to it. He kind of forgot about that. He tried to memorize it. Kaiser Wilhelm did. He made sure every ship had its own copy. Mahan's was kind of chronologically dealing with how the British dealt with the French during the Napoleonic Wars and the previous wars, like the 4 wars with Holland, the Dutch wars. And it didn't really deal with, if you are inferior naval power, how do you deal with a superior naval power? But he still swore by the book. Okay. Pre-Dreadnought navies. Dreadnoughts for 1905. Before then, different ships were out there, different types, massive technological changes. Pre-Dreadnought battleships were normally talked about as the primary standard by which navies were judged between the late 1980 or 1880s and before the launching of the HMS Dreadnought. At that time, France, Russia, Japan, US were all experimenting and expanding their navies. It was one of the things that the Kaiser was interested in. What they looked like, the HMS Armageddon, there was the pinnacle of pre-dreadnought battleships, triple expansion engines, not good fire control, and a plethora of different caliber of guns on it. They were the core of naval power in their days, but there are many other types and classifications of ships still in service. Different types of cruisers, and we'll go into what some of those were. Torpedoes were an emerging major threat to battleships. One of the things is England wasn't interested in torpedoes because that threatened the established way of the British Navy. So Mr. Whitehead, excuse me, took his invention and to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and proceeded to build it and sell it there and made lots and lots of money. Interesting thing, his daughter married a gentleman, a lieutenant in the Austro-Hungarian Navy, that they made a musical out of, a guy named Von Trapp. And yes, What Do You Do with Maria was in fact the governess who took over as Trapp's second wife after his first wife, Miss Whitehead, managed to die. Now, torpedo boats were designed to take the torpedoes to sea to sink battleships. And of course, you had to have a defense against torpedo boats. So torpedo boat destroyers were constructed to defend the fleet against torpedo boats. Jackie Fisher, the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty in Great Britain, basically cut down the name from torpedo boat destroyers to just destroyers, which are kind of what they're called to this day. British Naval Defense Act of 1889 set a two-power standard, saying the British Navy is going to be as big as the next two sea powers in the world. At that time, it was looking at France and Russia. They really weren't that concerned about America. And even as America developed its own sea power, they kind of went, well, that's not counting because you're not a European country. So we're not going to worry about it. UK officially maintained the two-power standard until after World War I and Washington Naval Disarmament Conference. But during the lead up to World War I, it was very clear that that two-power standard was really a one-power standard developed against or directed against the Imperial German Empire. And we'll see why in a few minutes. All right. How many ships do the British have? They had a boatload. 52 different pre-dreadnought battleships. All right. Now we get down to Alfred Tirpitz, born middle-class background in Brandenburg. He joined the Navy because one of his friends was joining the Navy. Was in charge of German torpedo and torpedo boat development for a while. Commanded 2 cruisers before becoming chief of staff of the Baltic Squadron. The German Navy High Command was not giving Wilhelm II what he wanted, which was ships that he could sail over to England and meet with equal terms on his uncle, Prince of Wales, or later King Edward VII. So Tirpitz was transferred to Berlin. Give us a background, give us the reasons for building a high seas fleet. Once again, the Kaiser commissioned a study. Tirpitz came up with what the study showed what the Kaiser wanted. So he got kudos for that. Findings of that study brought him into conflict with the Navy Secretary. Holman wanted a fleet that kind of represented what Germany's interest really needed. They were having an expanding merchant marine, so they really needed cruisers to protect that. Because they were operating around the globe. In the 1880s is when Germany acquired most of their overseas empire, largely because the treaty or the conference divvying up Africa was held in Berlin. Always helps to have Bismarck there on your side when handing out territory is there. After Tirpitz managed to get Holman fired, he gets a short stint with the premier deployed German Navy, the German East Asia Cruiser Squadron, and goes on from there. Finally, in 1897, he was appointed State Secretary for the basically Department of the Navy and remained there for 19 years. And he had a gut feeling and understanding what publicity would do for the Navy in Germany, and organized a German Navy League, really courted members of the Reichstag, and managed to get the program through the Reichstag and funded, and of course, after the 1900 Navy law was passed, Kaiser was very happy with Tirpitz and ennobled him. Lots of problems with his program. He wasn't interested in a lot of R&D, figured that research and development was really the sphere where private businesses should do it and take all the risks, and we would only buy solid concepts and developments that were very well documented and ready to go. He didn't want museum experiments, which caused German Navy to miss several things. First, naval acts. He had done one earlier, as I said, in the early 1890s, 1897. He does another memorandum. Why we need a Navy, what it's going to look like, proposes a law which will be executed over a period of time that neither the Reichstag nor the Navy could change. Key points: defines a principal enemy as Great Britain, with a primary area of operations between Helgoland, which is a little fly speck of an island off the northwest German coast, and the Thames River. Jeune École, which was the young school, my French is very inadequate, was a commerce rating type thing designed by an inferior naval power to kind of whittle down a superior naval power and impact their commerce. He didn't see that as necessary or impractical because Germany didn't have a whole lot of overseas bases to resupply ships. And you see the target there and what was in the Naval Act of 1898. He developed his risk theory, was that if the German Navy was big enough, didn't have to be big enough to win against the British Navy, but since the British Navy is what the British Empire depended upon to maintain an empire, if the German Navy could cause enough damage to the British Navy that the other countries around the world could then pile on to England, UK would be very hesitant to get involved in that type of a fight for fear of losing their naval superiority. This whole idea of the risk theory is one of the things that sparked the naval race between Germany and Great Britain in the first decade, to the ultimate detriment of Germany, because it took what was a very fairly friendly relationship. I mean, the kings of Great Britain had been the electors and kings of Hanover for 140 years. So kind of did away with that. Okay. 1898, England really didn't notice. Germany was still going to be behind France and Russia, two traditional enemies, as it were. The ships that they were developing weren't all that spectacular. There's an example of one of the ones, the SMS Odin. And where did they stand? Germany was right there in the middle of the pack as far as pre-Dreadnought battleships, large coast defense ship, etc. Right there, just a little bit above America, which was going through, sorry. Okay. Meantime, Kaiser had fired Bismarck and decided he wanted to take on world politics and make Germany a force throughout the world. Things were not going well in that regard. You can see a list of some of the problems. associated with the Kaiser running things. You know, East Asia Squadron arrives in Manila after Dewey had beat up on the Spanish squadron and tries to throw its weight around. Dewey says, you know, I just wiped out one squadron. I got no problem taking care of you guys as well. German support for the Boers, they actually sent weapons down to help the Boers fight the British. They sent volunteers, quote unquote. England didn't resort well to that. German Naval Act of 1900 says, we're not doing well in diplomacy because we don't have a big Navy. We need a big Navy. So he gets this Naval Act of 1900 passed, doubles the size of the Navy. 4 battle squadrons of 8 battleships. You can see the stuff there. Big thing there is a replacement schedule. They would automatically be replaced after 25 years. There wouldn't have to be any more votes in Parliament. They were going to get replaced on a continual basis. Of course, arms makers, the shipyard builders all loved this, had guaranteed employment for as long as they could see. U-boats, that was an emerging technology in 1900, and Tirpitz wasn't interested in emerging technologies and research and developments, as I said earlier. What they wind up with, based upon their studies, 24 pre-dreadnought battleships. And has their displacement, not real fast, not real big either. Okay, German diplomacy continues to go to pot. You know, Navy shelling a Venezuelan port kind of upsets America because that's Monroe Doctrine goes away. First Moroccan crisis. It was an attempt to pull France and England apart. You know, show England, the UK, that it's much better to be allied with the British or with the Germans than the French. The French had entered into an agreement with the British trying to diffuse tensions in Africa. And it just continued to evolve with that stuff. Instead of splitting up the Entente between France and UK, it actually strengthened it. Germany becomes isolated within Europe, except for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay. Second Moroccan crisis comes through there. Rebellion breaks out against the Sultan. French send in troops and basically establishes a protectorate over Morocco. Germany wanting to practice world politics, you know, you can't go in there without us. You need to let us know and have us participate. So they send in a gunboat and later a light cruiser to protect German economic interest in Morocco. The problem is they had to go send somebody down there to where the cruiser was to be the endangered German trader because there wasn't anybody down in the southern part of Morocco about that. You know, once again, they wanted compensation. There was a big impasse for a while. Tensions increased, you know, and since tensions were higher, the race to procure armaments increased. More people got the idea that there was, in fact, going to be a war sometime, and maybe not that far in the future. Franco-German negotiations led to a convention where Germany accepted France's position in Morocco with the exception, and they got this slice of, you know, a couple thousand, you know, square miles of swampland, mosquito farms. Not much. All right. Now, what happened there? Didn't promote an immediate response, but it did start to turn public opinion against Germany as the German Navy grew in strength. A lot of English pulp magazines contain stories about a German bolt from the blue that would send an army in to seize parts of England. And it didn't help that a German publication actually published a book on that as well. What happened is eventually over time, England abandoned its splendid isolation, which was basically the rule throughout the Victorian age. We will not take part in European affairs except as we deem necessary. So they first had the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, then the 1904 the Anglo-French Entente, and then later on in 1907 the Anglo-Russian Entente. Once again, urged on by the fact that they were starting to get worried about the German Navy. This allowed the British Navy, the Royal Navy, to concentrate in home waters to a much better degree than it had before. It also negated Tirpitz's risk theory, because now England has allies that are going to be on its side. Appropriations increased greatly for the Royal Navy. And then Jackie Fisher, the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty and the Royal Navy, designed and built the HMS Dreadnought in 1906, incorporating the lessons from the 1905 Battle of Tsushima between Russia and Japan, where Russia basically lost its entire navy that had not been previously deployed. They had taken their Baltic fleet, shipped it all the way around. They couldn't use Suez, so they shipped it by using colliers to refuel it all the way around Cape of Good Horn up. They spent some time in Cameron Bay. Remember, Russia was friendly with France, and then went on up to their demise at Tsushima. And here you got HMS Dreadnought, fifth ship of its name in the Royal Navy, launched 1906. Big ship. Remember the pre-dreadnoughts I was showing you? They were about 13,000 tons. Now we're up to 17, almost 18,000. I was looking at horsepower instead of the tonnage, sorry. And here we got small guns on top were anti-torpedo boat guns, basically quick firing guns. No protection for the crews, as you can see there. And then those slanted things across the way were torpedo nets. Not much use to a ship sailing, but when it's anchored, it's okay. This resulted in the Dreadnought Race. All previous rules had been overthrown with the all-big gun ship. Tirpitz welcomed it, thinking it would help him because all the counters are now won. There's one Dreadnought battleship that the British have, and we can start building our own. So, and it also reaffirmed the battleship's dominance in warfare for Tirpitz. Now, you have to understand, Tirpitz didn't have a lot of sea experience per se, and was chiefly in design and not in strategy, operations, or tactics for naval ships. And really didn't understand a lot of the stuff going on with technology at the time. Different changes to the naval laws that came through authorizing more. 1908 Naval Law revision. Now, instead of being 25 years for battleships, being replaced, it's on a 20-year cycle for all classes. Other battleship races started. South America had one. Turkey wanted to get battleships because they're worried about Greece getting battleships. And the cost went up exponentially, just out of sight. Once again, cost for battleships just about doubled, while heavy cruisers went for more than doubled price. Now, because of the efficiencies of the British shipbuilding industry, they only took about 24 months, 2 years to build a capital ship. France took a lot longer, up to 5 years. Germany took about 3 years. However, in 1909, an Admiralty study said German yards had the capacity to build as many as England did, which led the Admiralty for that year to a conclusion that Germans would have 17 dreadnoughts to Britain's 21 by the spring of 1912. This caused the Liberal government in the UK to have lots of problems because they were elected to cut down defense spending and spend it on, common good things like schools and social programs. The Conservatives had a field day. Some of the Liberals dropped away and caused them all sorts of stuff. The Royal Navy actually had asked for 6 ships that year. The government said we'll get 4 ships, so they compromised on 8. Typical British way of doing things. Remembering during this whole time period, the Navy's rate of growth continued and increased faster than the German armies did until 1912. 1912 is roughly 50% of what the German army had for a lot smaller personnel, but the battleships are expensive. 1912, they revised their naval law again, adding a 3rd battle squadron, more armored cruisers, more light cruisers, U-boats, finally, and increased money for R&D, increased personnel. Now, a big change or difference between the Royal Navy and the Imperial German Navy was, in both cases, the officers were long service individuals. In the Royal Navy, the seamen signed up for a 12-year initial tour, and they could re-up for a 10-year tour after their first one was finished so they could qualify for a pension. In the German Navy, they were drafted, just like they were in the Army. So that's what the design of it was supposed to be: a fleet flagship, 5 battle squadrons, a whole bunch of armored cruisers and light cruisers, and then overseas contingent as well. That gives you the percentage. Notice that after 1912, the Reichstag kind of said, yeah, we're not having this too much. The percentage of their budget compared to the Army went down by a good chunk, about a 1/3 drop between 1912 and 1913. They had basically outrun their support, both economically and in Parliament. Now, what was the Royal Navy's response? Winston Churchill had gone in as a Liberal member of Parliament into the British cabinet as the Home Secretary. There was a cabinet reshuffle, and he wound up over in the Admiralty. There was some talk of moving Haldane, who had been the war minister, over there, but they figured that the bad feelings between the British Army and the Royal Navy were such that that would not be a good thing. So they said, okay, we'll put Winston Churchill in there and he'll restrain the growth. Well, once he got in there, he saw the German threat and said, we need to do something about it, and changed his mind as far as economies of scale. So they changed their plans, what they're going to go through. They start transferring more ships home. They, encouraged the French to follow through on some previous discussions, saying, we're going to take care of your northwest coast of France. You take care of the Mediterranean. We will station 4 battle cruisers and 4 armored cruisers down there to counter the Austro-Hungarian Empire's Navy and the Italian Navy, even though Austria and Hungary and Italy didn't particularly like each other. Churchill also went through a lot of personnel reforms. In the 80 years prior to coming in there, the British seamen got like 1 shilling a month more in pay over 80 years. Things were not keeping up with inflation at all. So there are a lot of personnel reforms. Jackie Fisher, once again, the first Sea Lord, which was the uniform guy in the Admiralty, pushed through. And then he also, at this point in time, they were designing the 5 oil-fired, not coal-fired, but oil-fired Queen Elizabeth class battleships. He adopted 15-inch guns for them, which was a massive increase in their throw weight. Jackie Fisher also had the idea for battle cruisers. Before, remember, there weren't radar, there weren't a whole lot of other things. Destroyers had extremely short ranges, so cruisers were out there to scout out for the battleships in the fleet. And he developed the battle cruiser idea. Similar, it could outfight anything, could catch it, it could outrun anything that couldn't fight. Designed almost simultaneously with the Dreadnought. However, it had some major design flaws when put in a line of battle against battleships. And there's the SMS Goeben in outline, which was made a cruise through the Mediterranean, much to the disagreement and the disgruntlement of the French and the British during the first month of the war, helping to bring Turkey into the war. Okay. Battle cruisers worked the Falklands when they did track down von Spey's East Asia Cruiser Squadron and destroy it. But at Jutland, you can see the results when battle cruisers went up against battleships. Things did not do well. Cruisers used to be called frigates back in Napoleonic times. Long-range, independent, not designed to defeat battleships, but able to do a lot of presence operations, do other things that needed to be done. Once they started getting an armored core, they started being called armored cruisers, only a narrow band of armor along the waterline. Terminology was changing a lot about that through the time. It had to have sails because not enough coaling stations existed. Because they were sailing ships, they had to have a high freeboard, which meant they couldn't put turrets on them because that was too much weight, too high, make them unsteady. So they renamed them into protected cruisers. Those still existed in World War I. And then late 1880s, because of quick firing cannon, like the French 75 that we have there in the museum, and other guns, they came back to armored cruisers as side armor again became a priority. So they were expensive ships to have and only added limited capabilities to the battle line. Then you had other types of cruisers, second class, third class scout cruisers. Light cruisers came into being around the turn of the 20th century, trying to combine multiple roles of cruisers into one hull. As they both sides got experience with them, they became increasingly better. The Germans were very late in adopting larger guns on their cruisers. That caused them lots of problems early in the war when German cruisers and British cruisers were shooting at each other. The British had 6-inch guns and the cruisers had 105 millimeter guns. Destroyers, I mentioned earlier, defense against torpedo boats. Almost every country called them destroyers in the First World War, except Germany. In Germany, they were being called torpedo boats. They got larger throughout the war. Destroyer versus destroyer engagements happened a lot during the war, even though main battle actions did not happen all that often. And of course, you can see at the bottom, the German auxiliary mine layer was fired on by a British destroyer as it was attempting to lay mines in the Thames estuary. Submarines. We learned a lot about them during the war. The French in 1904 were the lead with most boats under construction. Germany was just starting their first boats. 1910, they adopted diesel engines. All countries didn't really know how to use submarines right prior to the war. They had lots of theories. A lot of times submarines were going to be used for coast defense, harbor defense type things because they didn't have much range, didn't have much endurance. So that's probably a pretty good way to do it. Some people in both the Royal Navy and the Imperial Navy thought they could be used instead of cruisers as scouts out there. They could hide, report stuff, etc. And they were experiments on both sides trying to figure out how to incorporate them into fleet maneuvers. You can see what their Imperial Navy's pre-war plans, not a lot of submarines. Okay. War kicks off. It doesn't have very many U-boats for Germany. 1915, Tirpitz reconsiders his basic strategy, given the success of U-boats and the fact that the high seas fleet is basically swinging an anchor and not doing much. A couple of new developments as the war broke out. They initially ordered more submarines, and then they developed two different types. Both the UB boat and the UC boats were designed for shallow water operations, such as the English Channel, off the Belgium coast, the Adriatic Sea, that type of place. The UB submarine was originally going to have torpedoes as its weapons. UC boats were launching mines. As the war continued, the types kind of merged as different flights of these submarines were developed. And by the end of the war, both UB and UC boats could deploy both torpedoes and mines. Yeah. In the war, they built 334 U-boats of all types. Key metric, they never had more than 60 at sea at one time. And the fact they sunk, 10 million tons of shipping, that's a pretty good, results for small size, small crews. British had their own submarines. Interesting to me was that British subs were set in the Baltic, and where they attacked, German vessels carrying Swedish iron ore. Boom, they're torpedoing ships at sea, much like they complained about the Germans torpedoing, ships at sea in the English Channel, etc. British submarines were all lost after the Germany and Russia made peace in 1918. Their crews basically scuttled them because the Russians were required under the terms of the agreement to hand over all the submarines to the Germany. They also played a part in the Mediterranean where they went up the Dardanelles and attacked Turkish supply transport and combat ships. But the fact that British submarines were out there as well as German submarines meant that target identification on both sides was a little hairy at times. The first battle in August of 1914, the Helgoland Blight, British submarines were out there to act as decoys to lure German torpedo boats towards a destroyer sweep by the British. The Grand Fleet sent down a squadron of light cruisers and a battle cruiser squadron. Nobody bothered to tell the British submarines, and they attempted to torpedo their own ships. Fortunately, not for the British, nothing happened in that regards. Anti-submarine warfare, non-existent in 1914. They came up with thousands of ideas on what to do with it. Interesting, the one that finally made the difference was the adoption of the convoy system, and that was fought tooth and nail by the Royal Navy, and basically had to be rammed down their throat by the politicians. Convoy system proved to be very effective during the Napoleonic Wars and all the other naval wars. And in fact, things like troop convoys were in fact escorted. But they were worried about, well, it's going to clog the ports too much. It's going to be, merchant skippers couldn't stay in formation. They would be reduced to the speed of the last slowest ship. Concentrate the targets for the U-boats. Well, in some ways it did, but it emptied the sea so that a string of U-boats, only one U-boat was going to find it. And it could fire maybe 2 torpedoes before the escorts got a hold of it and forced it to break contact. And the rest of everybody else would be out there just, pounding down the water, not doing anything. Barrages, barriers, nets, mines, detection devices, surface boats designed choke points to detect the passage of submarines. Late in the war, the one on the English Channel was actually illuminated at night using the electric lights from the various surface ships. The Dover barrage was really not very effective until late in the war. The rapid tides, etc., and even though sizable number of ships and resources were not enough to choke it down, but late in the war they finally got it choked down. The one off the Straits of Ortano is equally non-effective. Some of that had to do with the convoluted chain of command for the navies in the Mediterranean. There were about 10 navies involved, and each of them had their own little slice of the pie and didn't want to cooperate with anybody. Mines, used a lot. Almost 250,000 mines dropped off during the war. British were not interested in mine warfare prior to the war breaking out, unlike the Germans. Once the Royal Navy saw how effective were, they actually got on board with it. It was only American industrial power which allowed enough mines to be produced to produce the North Sea barrage up there. And that basically helped just concentrate the open areas where escorts had to go. So fairly sizable number, 1.1 million. So about 10% of merchant shipping were sunk by mines. Fairly sizable chunk of naval power as well. Mine sweeping, very slow. None of the techniques developed during the First World War were really good under fire. This caused both countries, or both sides, massive problems. The Dardanelles, the Allies lost 4 pre-dreadnought battleships basically in a day. The mines has a detrimental effect upon the morale of the people bombarding the shore. And up in the Gulf of Riga, the German Navy had a lot of problem with Russian mines up there as well when they tried to, and actually succeeded in finally capturing the islands off the Gulf of Riga. In a fairly the division plus size amphibious operation in October of 1917. Air power, once again, very primitive at the time. They did use Zeppelins a lot. Scheer really wanted to use Zeppelins during the Battle of Jutland. Unfortunately, the weather conditions did not really support. Ernst Hinkel developed a pretty good biplane fighter. You can see it down there in the lower right-hand corner. It was actually on a Swedish ship. That picture was taken in the 1920s. And they actually launched torpedoes from German planes during the war. The German naval air arm, fairly sizable, but they had a very large attrition of their Zeppelins during the war. A lot of weather conditions took them down, as well as British air defenses. Where are we at? We're ready for the war kicked off. Talked about the different groups operating or reporting directly to the supreme warlord himself, God's gift to mankind, Kaiser Wilhelm. And he didn't coordinate any of them worth a darn. He did put a chokehold after the Battle of Helgoland Blight, in that he wouldn't let the high seas fleet go out unless it could be guaranteed a victory. And in combat, guarantees are darn hard to come by. Where they stand as far as how many ships they have in building and in service, 15 to 22 against Great Britain doesn't sound really all that bad if you can pick your timing right. But notice Great Britain had 13 building and Germany only had 5 building. They were massively behind in almost every other category as well. And as the war went on, it had an impact upon Germany's ability to build ships. Notice the size of its merchant shipping in 1914, second largest merchant marine in the world. A lot of it took refuge in neutral ports once the war broke out. There it was seized by powers as they joined the war, like in America. Okay. Originally, the Royal Navy, the heirs of Nelson, Trafalgar, etc., was going to go for the big, decisive battle early. Didn't happen. You can see that one. The German Navy expected the British Navy to institute a close blockade of the German coast, which would allow them to do hit and runs and attrit the Royal Navy. In 1912, 2 years before the outbreak of the war, the British decided, mines and torpedoes, this is not a good idea. Plus, we've got to have 3 times the number of destroyers because our destroyers are extremely short legs, and 2/3 of them are going to be either going to or coming from port to read coal. So, causes us lots of problems. So they decided we're going to do a distant blockade. War had 3 campaigns. Both sides were trying to trick the other ones down, defeat them in detail. The Allies were able to use their command of the seas to exploit their colonial possessions to resource the European war. The original British Expeditionary Force was 1 cavalry division and 2 corps of 2 divisions each, or 5 divisions on the west side of the French army. During this time period, they were able to bring all their 34 battalions of regular long-term service troops from around the world and deposit them in northern France where they could form more divisions. This included shipping a corps of Indian troops from India to Europe, where they didn't do well in the climate conditions, unfortunately. And then blockade became ever more strict. And they monitored how much stuff was going into neutral countries like Norway, Sweden, Holland, so that they would not be able to increase their imports that they could then re-export to the Central Powers. One thing that helped on this thing was Room 40 of the Royal Navy. In 1917, it was redesignated as Intelligence Division 25. Cryptanalysis section, British Admiralty. Basically, the German Navy operations were an open book to the Royal Navy. They knew when the Imperial Navy was getting ready to sail, and so the Royal Navy could be ready for them. How it came from, captured naval code book captured by the Russians and a copy sent to the Royal Navy. The Australians captured the Handschriftsverkehrs book, and that got to London in October of 1914. And then finally, the miraculous gift of the fishes, a British trawler was sent out to recover items that had been seen being dropped off of a German torpedo boat that was in the process of sinking, and that contained the code used to communicate between naval attaches, embassies, and warships overseas. Germans had no idea this was happening. It was encrypted by a simple substitution cipher in addition to this one. The guy up on the upper right, Reginald Hall, had been captain of the Queen Mary when the war broke out. For health reasons, he couldn't stay at sea anymore, and so he took over room 40 as the director of naval intelligence. Ian Fleming worked for one of his successors later on, and it's believed that Reginald Hall was actually the inspiration for the character M in the 007 series of books. As a side note, German torpedo boats had a series of numbers and letters in front of their names. The S, B, G, whatever else, indicated which shipyard they came out of. Didn't have any other meaning. 1915, they lost at Falkland, they lost at Dodger Bank. Internal to the German Navy, well, we're going to go with main battle fleet, the Grosskrieg, our commerce rating, the Kleinkrieg. Germany declared a war zone around the British Isles. Not as very successful because they didn't have very many U-boats. They could stay on station at any one given time. And those U-boats that did make it on station didn't have very many torpedoes. You can see they sunk about half the new construction that was happening. This is buying high and selling low and trying to make it up in volume. 1916, Battle of Jutland, of course, dominates maritime operations. Resumed, unrestricted submarine warfare resumed. Got shut off again largely by pressure from the United States and other neutrals. Operation along the Flanders coast increased by a great deal in 1916 because a lot of stuff was going from England to support the BEF, and a lot of it got sunk. They sent out a wave of auxiliary cruisers. Some were more successful than others on the part of Germans. 1916, Tirpitz got fired, basically. He had been the big battleships for everything, and battleships are accomplishing nothing in spite of the hundreds of millions of marks and everything else going into them. And how are we going to do it? He tried to change his views towards submarines. It was kind of, well, you've been on battleship guy for 19 years, you opportunist, you. So he basically lost the confidence of the Kaiser, and Kaiser accepted his resignation. He then went on becoming a right-wing politician in the German government, or in the German Reichstag during the war, and then later in the Weimar Republic, same thing. Once again, they tried to defeat the British Navy, the Royal Navy in detail. They couldn't do it. After Jutland was over, basically Germany abandoned any attempts to build more surface warships. H&L being Hindenburg and Ludendorff went with their strategy. We're going to build a whole bunch of U-boats and sink everything. Notice right after Jutland, they're planning on a resumption of unrestricted U-boat warfare in February 1917. I talked about Room 40. Germany had a similar organization. The fact that German officer corps was not real tech savvy. They were, remember the Coast Guard ship, the Eagle, was actually a German Navy training ship. We're going to teach you how to be sailors by 3 years before the mast type thing. Not high on technology. So they weren't really into electronics at all. It was a German army unit stationed in Flanders started intercepting Royal Navy codes, and because the soldiers were bored, they decided to try to figure out how to break it. So they were able to intercept it, break it, and also do direction finding on it. The Imperial Navy used it as a tactical source and not for operational or strategic reasons. And then by May of 1916, they had a series of stuff set up to do it. It wasn't nearly as good as Room 40. Of course, they didn't have the advantage of capturing the three main codes being used by your opponent either. U-boat operations 1917. You can see the stories there. It came darn close to winning. You can see down there, February, March, April, you're getting that 500,000 tons sunk a year or a month. So, the German Navy had suffered significant ship losses. A lot of those were in the Baltic. Their torpedo boats and minesweepers needed replacement. They needed more Zeppelins, etc. So they concentrated strictly upon U-boats from, as I said earlier, into 1916 on the 1917 and 18. When the decision was made to do unrestricted submarine warfare, they only had 104 U-boats available. Not good. This talks about how those tonnages were so important to winning the war for Germany. It was based upon flawed analysis, garbage in, garbage out. They wanted them U-boats to reduce the amount of American munitions being delivered to the Allies. Next last bullet. Other German naval operations were to support U-boats instead of U-boats supporting surface unit operations. So sending out minesweepers to clear paths for the U-boats became very, very important. It meant less and less for the major ship units, the capital ships, to do. High Seas Fleet now providing manpower. The best junior officers enlisted skimmed off for new submarine crews. This left the less capable, less dedicated individuals on the surface fleet, which had a ripple effect down there. Summer 1917, there was a minor mutiny in the German High Seas Fleet. Was finally put down. About 3 sailors were shot. 1918, the impact of the British blockade became very evident to everybody. Convoys had been instituted over the Royal Admiralty's objections, and it had an impact. It cut losses significantly. You can see they commissioned 88 submarines, lost 67. Most importantly, they never really threatened to build up. Over Memorial Day, there were flags out there for, if I remember correctly, the 4 ships carrying soldiers of the AEF that were sunk on the way, but that's 4 out of how many thousand, going over. Scorecard, they sunk a lot of stuff, but they weren't enough. And interesting, in the Second World War, even though they were incredibly more efficient, their losses were also higher. Donitz, who was the German submarine commander in World War II, was command of a U-boat in the Mediterranean that was sunk when he tried to attack a convoy. And so he came up with the Wolfpack idea for World War II based upon his experiences in the First World War. So both sides were trying to learn lessons as they went through the war and extrapolate it forward. 1918, there is Operations Plan 19. We're going to go out there, and as the German army is getting pushed back along the Western Front, we're going to go take a last stab to regain the honor of the German Imperial Navy. The crews hear about this, and is largely on the battleships. The ships that had been used a lot, like the destroyers and the minesweepers, crews were pretty steady. They'd been employed, were doing important work, not so much on the battleships. They say, you German Navy officers, you can go commit suicide. We prefer to do something else. So they basically got called in. Hipper cancels the operation because of the ongoing mutinies. And then he makes the mistake of sending the mutiny ships to different ports, which just spread the mutiny. And of course, the fact that the Kaiser's beloved fleet had mutinied was another psychological blow, which probably contributed to his being willing to abdicate. Now, what happens? Okay, we've got an armistice. Allies, who's going to get what? What are the spoils of war? So they decide we're going to get 10 battleships, 10 battle cruisers, light cruisers, torpedo boats, and all the flipping U-boats. That's how we're going to divvy it up. And then we'll fight on who gets what. Germany can keep the rest of it because that's, basically they're not in condition to sail anyway. And so on 21 November, the world's second largest fleet surrenders. And here are some paintings that show kind of it, and a diagram shows how they go through. Notice the 6th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet with a U.S. flag. And yes, those were U.S. battleships up there. The picture up there, you can see them coming down, the German ships coming down between 2 rows of the Grand Fleet. Pretty stirring stuff to see. End of November, they're inspected before transfer to Scapa Flow, where they're interned, but they're not surrendered, they're just interned. They wanted to intern them in a neutral port. No port wanted the German Navy. Neutral wanted them. So they put them up in the Scapa Flow and basically confined to quarters up there. Food was delivered from Germany. Germany was starving the civilian populations. Good food didn't come up on time. A lot of it was bad. Mail was censored coming in. They couldn't visit with each other. They couldn't go on shore. They couldn't do anything. So 6 months after they surrendered or were interned, the admiral in charge of the fleet up there, which kind of it's not going to be me. It's kind of last man standing type thing. He got stuck surrendering the fleet. Put out the orders to scuttle the entire high seas fleet. And then in an afternoon, or actually in a morning, 500,000 tons of warship disappear into the ocean. There's some pictures of them sinking. There's a kind of a picture of the ones still left on the floor of Scapa Flow. During the 1920s, a lot of the stuff that was scuttled in shallow water was actually salvaged up, but there's still a bunch of 7 ships up there, the deepest part of Scapa Flow. And then you got, the scuttling solved a lot of problems. It also caused some problems. Now we don't have to worry about how to divvy up all those warships, but you took away our gains, what we've been fighting for. So what are we going to do? So Article 185, Treaty of Versailles, you had to surrender everything basically you got left. And those 400,000 tons of floating docks, cranes, tugs, and dredgers as reparations for losing them. This is what they had left, a bunch of pre-dreadnought battleships. I had a German instructor who was a young boy in Danzig in September 1939, and he saw the Schleswig-Holstein pre-dreadnought battleship prior to 1905 bombarding the Polish forts. Not much sea power. Implications of what it. They had an interesting system for building, trying to get the best bang for the Reichsmark. Never able to take care of persistent overruns and cost weight. They tried to attack the monopolies they had several times, but without a way of getting success. Caused a lot of problems for them later on. If you get interested in just one theory of warfare, it kind of removes other options to you, such as, if you're going to, battleships are the be all and end all, and we don't need U-boats. And then your theory of how you're going to fight is going to put limits on what you may or may not actually need. Couple of what ifs that I kind of like to think about: if they had removed a defensive force, cruisers, just torpedo boats and submarines, naval mines, and coast artillery for local defense, they would not have scared England. It wouldn't have been a problem, and with the relationship between Great Britain and Imperial Germany have been better. Could they use the resources saved from not funding a battle fleet to allow the 8 additional corps that Schlieffen wanted for the right wing? Could they have motorized 1 or 2 of their corps on that right wing to solve some of the Schlieffen's planned time distance problems? Because once they actually started and they got beyond the railroads where the Belgians had really wrecked their railroads, they actually put out a fairly large transportation force of trucks for the time period to continue trying to supply those troops. Kind of what if, so you can talk about all over. And now we'll go to questions. So.
Very good, Doug. That was fascinating. Let's see if anybody's got any questions, but I do have one. You read a lot of the general histories of the lead up to the war that talk about, everybody talks about the Dreadnaught Race. A lot of them present what happened around 1912 as the Germans finally gave up and realized they weren't going to be able to outbuild the British Navy. And that's why they cut back on procurement costs during 12 and 13, as you pointed out. You kind of imply that that really wasn't the main reason, that it was more internal.
There was a lot of internal problems in Germany at the time period. They were in a kind of a minor recession. So cutting costs was a big thing that the Reichstag wanted to do. They wanted to save money. They didn't like to raise taxes on themselves no more than anybody else did. And of course, a lot of the people in the Reichstag were the people paying a lot of taxes, or, were influenced by people paying lots of taxes. So yeah, the costs were tremendously cut down. The law was still there. They continued to build in accordance with the law. But once the war started out, there's a lot more uses for that steel and all the manpower. And the German mobilization system did not exempt highly skilled workers. So you had guys making radio sets for Siemens who got drafted, and did they go into a signal unit? No, they went in as infantry. And, the German shipyards had a hard time getting those guys back out of the trenches into shipbuilding. And that impacted their quality of their work and everything else throughout the rest of the war.
That's understandable. One other question that occurred to me, you talked about Tirpitz, and he became a naval cadet when he was 16, which in the 19th century was a little late. And then by the time he was 28, he's running their torpedo boat operation. And by the time he's 30, he's commanding a cruiser. This is not the trajectory that you see of a non-noble. This is a trajectory that you see of somebody whose family has great influence and whose career is being pushed by those above it. Are there other things about Tirpitz that explained his relatively rapid rise?
He was competent within his abilities. I mean, he had studied engineering, and he went through and actually did well at the torpedo school.
Mm-hmm.
And, remember, torpedoes were an item of great deal of development as they gained lethality and range and accuracy throughout this time period. And he could take that into his time period on a, cruisers in the Baltic. And because he'd given the Kaiser what Kaiser wanted back in 1891, he got plum assignments from that point on, and a lot of sponsorship by Wilhelm II. If you were one of his favorites, you're in pretty good shape. If you happen to be the first chief of the German General Staff after his father died, and he got critiqued honestly in the Army maneuvers, and that guy soon became a delegate to China. So Kaiser would reward those who brown-nosed him and would make sure that those who embarrassed him, quote unquote, by pointing him out that you are not God's gift to the German Empire, would send them off to places where they would not do well. One of the tidbits that I found in this thing that, as I was preparing it, there was a German lieutenant, a topographic engineer in Kaiser Wilhelm Land, northeast New Guinea, who was out there surveying the border to keep gold poachers down. And he never surrendered. He never did anything, unlike Borbeck in East Africa, who tied down 400,000 plus Allied troops. He basically went into a German missionary compound and stayed there for 4 years. In January of 1919, he came out full uniform, said, I'm here to surrender. And who the heck are you? He hadn't done anything. But so there was he had like 25 guys with him, and they just didn't do anything. They tried to escape one time, and a Australian ship kind of somewhat threatened to intercept them, and so they just turned back. So it was interesting that that guy, he wrote a book called 4 Years Among the Headhunters and made quite a profit off of it in 1920s Germany. So.
Oh, very politically incorrect. Well, the story of the Imperial Navy is a fascinating one. There's so many what ifs